Thank you very much. My name is Mary Holland. I teach at the NYU School of Law. I've written 2 books about vaccines. I'm a mother of a child who suffered a permanent vaccine injury, and I'm here to oppose LD798. I've always understood that informed consent is the bedrock of modern ethical medicine, and it does concern me greatly that those who support this bill would really be overriding informed consent. What I've heard listening here today is a real disconnect about the facts related to vaccines. The medical community that seems to be proposing this has never mentioned vaccine injury, and yet we've heard from many, many parents and others who've talked about the real risks associated with them. I was very disappointed to hear from the head of Maine CDC that they have no knowledge of the number of vaccine injuries in Maine. It would seem to me to be a lack of a feedback loop. If we have numbers about mandates, we have information about exemption rates, how can it be that we don't have any information about vaccine injury? So there is a lack of a feedback loop. There are very few checks and balances in this system.
Could you push your
I'm sorry.
up a little bit? It feels like you're yelling at us.
I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
I don't mean to be all you.
I know you
I
don't.
apologize. I apologize. So if you have mandates, you don't have markets, right? So you're not getting a feedback loop from a market that you'd get if you had a drug. There's liability protection, as other people have mentioned, so you don't have litigation on the back end. This is a huge distinction between drugs and vaccines. You also have lower safety standards for testing for vaccines than you have for drugs. For vaccines, you don't have to have double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. You have to have that for drugs. There's every incentive to put more and more vaccines on the schedule. There's no marketing expense. You have mandates. There's no liability on the back end. So there's not a good feedback loop here. The only sort of real feedback loop that you have here is the only way that you have real informed consent here is by having the religious, philosophical, and medical exemptions. If you take those away, or if you keep a very restricted medical exemptions, you really don't have informed consent, and you really don't have a feedback loop, and you really could be endangering a lot of people. You've heard today from the people who say that they're going to leave this state. It seems to me as an outsider from New York that it would be really tragic to lose some of the people that you've heard from. I think you have to listen to the parents. If I were in your shoes, I know I would keep the status quo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Senator Pulliam.
Thank you. From a legal perspective,
Yeah.
Let's say this committee were to pass this bill. And then there becomes this new vaccination, that is developed.
Right.
And people are required to take it. And this might seem a bit extreme, but let's say that, 20% of people that take this vaccination die. But for some reason, we've determined this needs to be done. I mean, from a legal perspective, would there be any way out of taking that?
No. Sad to say. So in 1986, Congress passed the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, and in 2011, the Supreme Court decided Brucewitz versus Wyeth. And you do not have a claim in any court, state or federal, for a defectively designed vaccine. So in effect, everything has to go to it has to go to the compensation program, and there really is no recourse in a court except for fraud. And as someone else previously mentioned, there are 2 federal cases right now against Merck for federally recommended childhood vaccines, MMR and HPV vaccine.
Thanks.
Representative Rudnicki.
Yes.
HPV vaccine.
Yes, ma'am. Wrote a book about it.
Okay. I'm actually quite concerned what I've heard about this recently. So tell me a little bit about that. For what you said, you wrote a book about the HPV. Tell me a little bit about why it's the lawsuit, that type of thing, just so I can get a...
Sure.
Just briefly.
Yeah, briefly. So my co-author, Kim Mack-Rosenberg, is also here and will testify. The clinical trials were fatally flawed. There have been over 450 reported deaths. There have been over 60,000 reported injuries to the vaccine adverse event reporting system. It's never been proven to prevent any cancer, let alone cervical cancer, which is what it was designed for. It's a global issue. There are lawsuits going on in Colombia, in Australia, in many countries of the world, and there's a current case in state court, I shouldn't say, I said federal, it's in state court in California, Roby versus Merck, which Kim will address, and it's for fraud, and it's for deprivation of informed consent, and it's for medical battery, and it's a serious lawsuit. It's a very serious case, and that's on the federally recommended schedule for girls and boys.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have one more question. Sorry. I know I just got back and I'm asking
Yeah,
questions.
you
but
had a long break. We
This is-
haven't.
Sorry.
I actually didn't have a break. I did go to a legislative reception. So
I'm not getting in the middle of that.
I think you might have touched on it briefly. I missed it probably. Where does your passion about this issue derive from? Did you have a personal
I do,
experience with
yeah.
your child? or-
So I come from this hyper-medicalized family. Both my parents were physicians. My uncle was the medical director of the FDA. I have uncles and siblings who are all doctors. I was totally pro-vaccine, just like many of the people here who've testified in support. And my child suffered severe permanent brain injury. So I wanted to understand what went wrong and bring my skill set, which is as a lawyer. And so I've really studied the law, and the law, there's no feedback loop. There's no feedback loop.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.